Before Rome, before Greece, the world's first cities arose from the mud between two rivers and changed humanity forever. This is where history began, not in scattered myths or broken stones, but in rising towers of brick, laws etched in clay, and stories written in the language of gods and kings. This is Mesopotamia. This is the ancient Middle East. And this is where time was first written. Here, between the Tigris and Euphrates, people built more than shelters. They built societies. They didn't just survive the world, they organized it. They planned streets, counted the seasons, named stars, and negotiated with the divine. This was the cradle of civilization, where the first cities, Uruk, Eridu, and Ur, grew from sacred ground into complex networks of commerce, ritual, and administration. Before the idea of Europe even existed, Sumerian scribes were pressing wedges into wet clay, creating the first written language. Kings ruled not by brute force, but through institutions, taxes, temples, and law. But this timeline is more than Mesopotamia. The ancient Middle East was a mosaic of cultures and kingdoms, each adding their stone to the foundation of the modern world. From the Akkadian Empire that dreamed of unity, to the Babylonian kings who laid down the first codes of law, to the Assyrian war machines that carved fear and order in equal measure, this region was never still. It pulsed with innovation, ambition, and conflict. And it was not limited to the land between rivers. The Levant gave the world prophets and alphabets. Anatolia harnessed iron and shaped new powers from mountain stone. Persia built roads that spanned continents and ruled not just by sword, but by tolerance and vision. This wasn't just the beginning of writing and architecture. It was the beginning of empire, of diplomacy, of sacred thought. But these stories have often been flattened into fragments, reduced to footnotes under the shadows of Greece and Rome. Today, we reclaim them. We walk back through time along the ziggurat stairs and palace gates to rediscover the cities that birthed civilization itself. And it begins where humanity first wrote its name in clay. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something extraordinary happened. Humanity stopped wandering. Instead of following herds and seasonal rains, people began to settle, sow, and shape the world around them. Here in southern Mesopotamia, they built something the world had never seen: cities. The Sumerians didn't just found settlements, they invented civilization. It was in Sumer that the blueprint for urban life emerged: agriculture, government, religion, law, and perhaps most transformative of all, writing. The first of these cities was Eridu, regarded in myth and memory as the oldest city on earth. But it was Uruk that became the shining star of the Sumerian world. By 3000 BCE, Uruk was a sprawling metropolis with over 40,000 people, an immense number for the ancient world. Protected by thick mud brick walls and crowned by towering ziggurats, Uruk was not just a city. It was a statement, a declaration that humans could shape land, water, and sky to serve their purposes. The ziggurats themselves, massive stepped pyramids rising above the flat plains, were more than temples. They were bridges between heaven and earth, connecting people to the divine. Life in these early cities revolved around both religion and record keeping. The gods were thought to own the cities, and priests managed their earthly estates. Temples acted not only as places of worship, but also as administrative centers. Offerings, rations, land deeds, everything had to be tracked. And so, the Sumerians created something revolutionary: writing. At first, it was pictographic, used to count grain and sheep. But by around 3200 BCE, it had evolved into a system called cuneiform, wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay tablets using a reed stylus. Cuneiform transformed human cognition. With it, memory could be externalized, history could be written, laws could be preserved, literature could be imagined. The Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed in cuneiform, is the world's oldest known epic, a poetic reflection on kingship, mortality, and the quest for meaning. These were not just economic or political societies. They were deeply philosophical, reflective, and aware of their place in the cosmos. Sumerian society was organized around city-states, each ruled by a lugo, a king who was part warrior, part priest, and part administrator. These rulers didn't just command armies. They supervised irrigation canals, temple construction, and legal disputes. The Sumerians mastered the art of coordination, managing labor forces, crop cycles, and religious festivals with astonishing precision. Their agricultural success depended on the controlled flooding of the rivers, requiring sophisticated engineering and cooperation. In many ways, bureaucracy was born in Sumer, alongside the first notions of civic responsibility and codified law. Trade flowed through the streets of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash. Merchants carried goods in and out of Mesopotamia: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, tin from Anatolia. The Sumerians were not isolated inventors. They were cultural catalysts, connecting the Near East into a larger web of exchange. Their technological breakthroughs, from the wheel to the plow, spread far and wide, laying the groundwork for future civilizations. Religion infused every aspect of life. The gods were numerous, each associated with natural forces and celestial bodies. Inanna, the goddess of love and war; Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water; Enlil, the god of air and divine authority. The Sumerians believed that their cities had been founded by the gods themselves, and humans existed to serve them. Daily rituals, seasonal festivals, and temple rites kept this cosmic order in balance. Yet even within this religious framework, the Sumerians were surprisingly pragmatic. Their temple economies ran on detailed accounting, and legal disputes were settled with contracts and judges. Socially, Sumerian society was stratified. At the top were the nobility and priests, followed by merchants, artisans, farmers, and finally enslaved persons, often prisoners of war. Yet despite this hierarchy, there was mobility. Scribes, for instance, held significant prestige, as literacy granted access to power. Schools, or edubas, trained young boys to master cuneiform, memorize proverbs, and copy out administrative texts. These were the first institutions of formal education in human history. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumer was a land of walled cities, soaring temples, coded laws, and living literature. It had transformed the human experience, moving civilization from oral memory to written legacy, from tribal governance to organized statecraft. Its legacy would ripple outward, influencing Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and even the Greeks and Romans millennia later. And yet, Sumer's greatest contribution wasn't a single artifact or king. It was the very idea that people could live together in organized, complex societies with shared laws, written contracts, religious calendars, and collective memory. This was the invention of civilization, not in name, but in function. They made cities not only livable, but meaningful. Theirs was the first attempt to map the heavens, rule the earth, and make sense of death. In the story of the ancient Middle East, Sumer is the prologue, but it is also the cornerstone. Everything that came afterward, every law, every empire, every written word was in some way built atop the foundation they laid in clay. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the cities of Sumer were thriving, but they were also fragmented. Each city-state was proud, independent, and often at war with its neighbors. Their walls rose as symbols of both their wealth and their distrust. For centuries, alliances shifted and rivalries burned as kings of Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Uruk fought for supremacy. It was in this fractured landscape that a new force emerged from the north. A man whose vision would reshape the political landscape of the ancient world forever. His name was Sargon of Akkad. Sargon's rise is the stuff of legend. According to later inscriptions, he began as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a trusted servant in the royal court. But Sargon was no ordinary attendant. He was ambitious, brilliant, and ruthless. Seizing power through a combination of military cunning and political maneuvering, he took the throne and set out to do what no one before him had achieved: unite all the Sumerian city-states under a single rule. This was not merely conquest for conquest's sake. It was the birth of the world's first empire. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon launched a series of campaigns that swept through Sumer. City after city fell under his command. Uruk, Ur, Lagash all became part of a single political entity centered around his new capital, Akkad. Though the exact location of Akkad remains lost to archaeologists, its symbolic power in history is immense. Sargon claimed divine favor, portraying himself as chosen by the goddess Inanna, Ishtar, to bring order to the land. This was more than political propaganda. It was a new model of kingship. Sargon was not just a local ruler. He was a king of all lands, a concept unprecedented in Mesopotamian history. Under Sargon's rule, the Akkadian Empire expanded far beyond the Sumerian heartland. His armies marched north into the Levant, west toward the Mediterranean, and east toward Elam in present-day Iran. These conquests were accompanied by a sophisticated administrative system designed to hold this vast territory together. Instead of simply looting cities and retreating, Sargon installed loyal governors, standardized taxation, and integrated conquered elites into his bureaucracy. He placed his trusted officials, often family members, in key positions, ensuring loyalty to the imperial center. This was a radical departure from the loose alliances of the Sumerian past. One of Sargon's most important legacies was linguistic and cultural. While the Sumerians had developed cuneiform writing, the Akkadians adapted it to their own Semitic language, creating a linguistic bridge between different peoples. Over time, Akkadian became the lingua franca of the region, used in diplomacy, trade, and administration for centuries, even after the empire itself faded. This shift in language marked a turning point. From a collection of isolated city-states with their own dialects to a unified political and cultural zone connected through a common tongue. The Akkadians also developed one of the earliest professional standing armies. Unlike the citizen militias of the city-states, Sargon's army was permanent and centrally controlled. Soldiers were paid, trained, and stationed throughout the empire to maintain order and suppress rebellion. This innovation allowed Sargon to hold power over a vast and diverse territory in a way no one had before. The idea of a standing army, loyal to a single ruler rather than to local cities, would echo through history, influencing later empires from Assyria to Rome. Religion too took on a new imperial dimension under Akkad. Sargon and his successors positioned themselves as chosen agents of the gods,
particularly in Nana, whose cult spread widely during this period. Temples were built or restored across the empire, not just as spiritual centers but as instruments of state power. Through religion, Sargon legitimized his rule over peoples who had once been fiercely independent, embedding imperial ideology in daily ritual. Sargon's dynasty endured for about a century, reaching its zenith under his grandson, Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin declared himself king of the 4 quarters of the world, a title that reflected both ambition and reality. He expanded the empire to unprecedented heights and famously depicted himself in divine form on the victory stele, wearing the horned crown of a god, the first Mesopotamian ruler to do so. This was a bold statement. The king was no longer merely chosen by the gods. He was divine himself. The empire became not just political, but cosmic in its self-image. But even this mighty structure was not immune to collapse. Over time, internal rebellions, administrative strain, and external pressures eroded Akkadian power. The most dramatic blow came from the east, with the incursions of the Gutians, a mountain people whose attacks destabilized the empire. By around 2154 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had fragmented, its cities returned to local control, and its central authority dissolved. Yet the fall of Akkad did not erase its impact. The Sumerians would briefly reassert themselves during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, but the world had changed. The idea of empire, of one ruler commanding many lands through bureaucracy, language, and military power, had been born. Akkad became a model for all who came after. Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans would each, in their own ways, inherit and adapt Sargon's vision. In many ways, Akkad represents the moment when human politics scaled up. It was no longer about one city competing with another. It was about vast territories, centralized power, and a new understanding of what kingship could mean. Sargon's name echoed in legend for over a millennium after his death, inspiring later rulers to claim his mantle. His empire may have been the first to rise and fall, but its blueprint endured, etched not in clay alone, but in the very concept of empire itself.
As the echoes of Akkad faded into the dust, new powers emerged from its ruins, heirs to the idea of empire, yet determined to redefine its meaning. Among these successors, 2 names would dominate the Mesopotamian world for centuries: Babylon and Assyria. If Akkad invented empire, Babylon refined its soul, and Assyria forged its sword. Together, they formed a dual legacy of law and conquest, intellect and intimidation. 2 visions of state power rooted in the same ancient soil, yet driven by very different engines. Babylon in southern Mesopotamia rose to prominence in the 18th century BCE under a ruler whose name still resonates across the ages: Hammurabi. More than a king, Hammurabi was a lawgiver, diplomat, and strategist. His greatest achievement, the Code of Hammurabi, is one of humanity's oldest and most complete legal codes, carved into stone and placed in public view. This was not merely a set of arbitrary rules, it was a statement that law could govern society, not just the whims of rulers. The famous phrase, "an eye for an eye," comes from this code, but behind the harshness was a vision of order, structure, and justice. It regulated commerce, family life, labor, and property, defining social roles and responsibilities with a surprising detail. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became a political and cultural capital, uniting much of southern and central Mesopotamia. The city itself, already ancient, blossomed into a center of learning, religion, and architectural grandeur. Temples rose to honor Marduk, the city's patron god, who was elevated to the head of the Mesopotamian pantheon. during Hammurabi's reign. This was no accident. It reflected the political dominance of Babylon over its rivals. As Marduk rose, so did the prestige of the Babylonian dynasty. Yet Babylon's golden age under Hammurabi was not the end of the story. The city would rise and fall, be conquered and reconquered multiple times. But its influence, its ideals of centralized law, priestly scholarship, and urban sophistication endured. Babylon became a symbol, an idea as much as a place. Even long after its political power waned, the name carried weight. In biblical texts, it was remembered with awe and ambivalence, as both the center of learning and the city of exile. To the north, however, a very different kind of power was rising. Assyria, once a small kingdom on the upper Tigris, transformed over centuries into one of the most formidable military empires the ancient world had ever seen. If Babylon ruled through culture and persuasion, Assyria ruled through force and fear. Beginning in the 14th century BCE and reaching its peak in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to Egypt, a vast domain held together by steel, strategy, and surveillance. The Assyrians perfected the machinery of imperial control. Their armies were disciplined, well-equipped, and brutal. Siege warfare, battering rams, sappers, these were Assyrian specialties. They didn't just win wars, they crushed resistance with psychological precision. Conquered peoples were deported, resettled, and replaced. A tactic designed to break tribal and ethnic cohesion and prevent rebellion. The empire was ruthless, but it was not chaotic. Roads were built to move troops quickly. Intelligence networks kept the court informed. Governors ruled provinces with authority delegated from the king, and loyalty was enforced through fear and reward alike. But the Assyrians were not only warriors. They were builders and record keepers. Their capital cities, Assur, Kalhu, Nimrud, and above all, Nineveh, were showcases of imperial ambition. Palaces covered in carved reliefs told stories of conquest, hunting, and divine favor. Libraries were filled with thousands of clay tablets, preserving myths, omens, scientific texts, and administrative records. The most famous of these was the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, an astonishing collection of knowledge that has survived in fragments to this day. Without it, we might never have recovered the Epic of Gilgamesh or the myths of the Sumerian gods. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Ashurbanipal were not just conquerors. They were administrators, reformers, and sometimes scholars. They understood that an empire needed more than violence. It needed vision. Under their rule, Assyria became not just a military state, but a model of bureaucratic control. The empire was divided into provinces, each taxed and monitored. Art and propaganda were used strategically to glorify the king and legitimize expansion. Yet Assyria's strength was also its vulnerability. Its conquests bred resistance. Its ruthlessness created enemies. And its sprawling bureaucracy eventually became too heavy to sustain. In the late 7th century BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes stormed Nineveh. The city was sacked, the empire crumbled, and the once mighty Assyrian war machine fell silent. It was a violent end to a reign of violence. Still, both Babylon and Assyria left marks that time could not erase. Babylon's reverence for law and learning, Assyria's mastery of administration and warfare. Together, they shaped the political imagination of the Middle East, showing that power could be projected not just through temples or towers, but through ideas, institutions, and fear. In the ancient Middle East, empires did not merely conquer land. They conquered time by writing law,
building monuments, and recording their own legacies. Babylon and Assyria did not just rise and fall, they defined the possibilities of civilization and empire. And the shadow would stretch far into the future, across Persia, Greece, Rome, and even into the world we live in today.
After the violent fall of Assyria in the late 7th century BCE, the ancient world paused, but only briefly. From the ashes of Nineveh, a familiar name rose once more: Babylon. Long a symbol of law, religion, and cultural refinement, Babylon returned to power not as a nostalgic echo of its past, but as the engine of a new Mesopotamian renaissance. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, centered once again in the storied city along the Euphrates, reasserted southern Mesopotamia's place as a global center of power, art, and sacred knowledge. This resurgence reached its zenith under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE. His name is often remembered through biblical references, particularly as the king who destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem and initiated the Babylonian captivity. But Nebuchadnezzar's legacy stretches far beyond that moment of exile. He was not merely a conqueror, he was a visionary builder. Under his rule, Babylon became one of the most magnificent cities the world had ever seen. Vast processional avenues, intricately glazed brick walls, and majestic temples adorned the urban landscape. The famed Ishtar Gate, with its deep blue tiles and golden lions and dragons, stood as a symbol of Babylonian might and divine favor. It was not just a gate, it was a work of spiritual architecture, designed to awe, to intimidate, and to inspire. Central to Nebuchadnezzar's project was the restoration of religious institutions. Temples to Marduk, the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, were rebuilt and expanded. The great Ziggurat Etemenanki, believed by some to be the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, was reconstructed as a cosmic axis, a bridge between heaven and earth. Religion in Neo-Babylon was not an accessory to politics, it was its foundation. Kingship was legitimized through divine favor, and the city itself was imagined as the center of the universe. To rule Babylon was to rule under the eyes of the gods. But Nebuchadnezzar was also a man of empire. His military campaign stretched across the Levant, bringing Phoenician cities and the kingdom of Judah under Babylonian control. It was during one of these campaigns in 586 BCE that Jerusalem fell, the temple was destroyed, and thousands of Israelites were exiled to Babylon. This event had seismic consequences, not just for Jewish history, but for the cultural legacy of the region. In Babylonian exile, Jewish scribes began to consolidate oral traditions into written scripture. What would become the Hebrew Bible was, in many ways, shaped in the shadow of Babylon. Thus, the Neo-Babylonian Empire became not only a political force, but an unexpected incubator of religious identity and literary canonization. Culturally, Babylon thrived during this period. Scholars maintained astronomical records with remarkable precision. Babylonian astronomers tracked planetary movements, developed lunar calendars, and recorded celestial phenomena that would later influence Greek and Islamic science. The city's temples often doubled as centers of scholarship, where priestly elites studied omens, medicine, mathematics, and myth. Babylonian cosmology, with its layered heavens, watery chaos, and divine councils, continued to shape a regional spiritual imagination. One of the most enduring legends from this era is that of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a marvel of engineering said to be built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median wife, who missed the green hills of her homeland. While no definitive archaeological evidence for the gardens has been found in Babylon, the story speaks to the city's reputation for grandeur, beauty, and human ingenuity. Whether real or romanticized, the Hanging Gardens became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, linking Babylon in the popular imagination to paradise itself. What made the Neo-Babylon distinct was not just its wealth or military power, but its self-conscious return to the past. This was a civilization that looked backward as it moved forward. It revived Sumerian titles, restored Akkadian rituals, and rebuilt temples in styles that recalled the Ur Third Dynasty. In doing so, it anchored its identity in the deep time of Mesopotamia. Babylon's greatness was measured not only by its conquests, but by its continuity, a living thread connecting the present to a mythic past. Yet, despite its achievements, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was short-lived. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar II, the empire began to weaken due to internal instability and succession crisis. Its final king, Nabonidus, was a controversial figure who spent years away from the capital and alienated the priesthood of Marduk by promoting the moon god Sin. By the time the Persian army approached Babylon in 539 BCE, the empire was already fractured.
When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon, it was not with destruction, but with diplomacy. The city's gates were opened, and the Persian king proclaimed respect for Babylonian traditions. But even under Persian rule, something had shifted. The political independence of Babylon was gone, yet its cultural and spiritual influence endured, embedded in texts, temples, and teachings that would survive empires. The Neo-Babylonian period was a final flowering of native Mesopotamian power before the region was absorbed into larger imperial systems. It was a renaissance not in the European sense, but in a Mesopotamian one, a return to sacred order, civic splendor, and cultural memory. In this brief window, Babylon once again became the center of the world, not because it ruled over it, but because it remembered how civilization began. The story of Neo-Babylon is not just a tale of resurgence, it is a reflection on memory. How a civilization looks to its ancestors, raises monuments to their wisdom, and tries to become worthy of their legacy. Before the world changed, Babylon rose once more to remind it what was possible.
When Babylon's walls opened to Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, it marked not just the end of an empire, but the beginning of something new. The Persians did not rise from within Mesopotamia. They came from the Iranian plateau, from highlands to the east, from a people once dismissed as peripheral. But in just a few generations, these Persians would build the largest and most cosmopolitan empire the ancient world had ever known. And they would do it not through annihilation, but through absorption, bridging east and west, past and future, with a system of governance so advanced that its echoes would be felt from Alexander to Washington. Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great, was unlike any conqueror before him. He did not burn cities to the ground or scatter their gods. Instead, he preserved them. Upon entering Babylon, he issued the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document often considered the world's first charter of human rights. It proclaimed religious freedom, respect for local customs, and the restoration of displaced peoples to their homelands. Among those he freed were the Jews, exiled in Babylon since the destruction of Jerusalem. Cyrus allowed them to return, to rebuild the temple, and to practice their faith. This was not an act of mercy. It was a calculated principle of imperial governance. Rule through respect, not repression. Under Cyrus and his successors, the Achaemenid Empire stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, encompassing Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and parts of Central Asia. It was a super empire, a mosaic of languages, religions, and cultures. To manage this vast domain, the Persians developed an administrative system of unparalleled sophistication. The empire was divided into satrapies, provinces governed by satraps or regional administrators who reported directly to the king. These governors had considerable autonomy, but were kept in check by a network of royal inspectors known as the King's Eyes and Ears. Communication and infrastructure were central to Persian power. The royal road, stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa to Sardis, enabled couriers to cross the empire in mere days. Relay stations, stables, and way stations dotted the road, forming an ancient version of the postal system. This connectivity not only allowed the emperor to assert control, but also facilitated trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Goods from India, China, Greece, and Egypt flowed through Persian lands, transforming the empire into a vibrant conduit of global commerce.
Religion too played a vital role, and in Persia it took a unique form. Zoroastrianism, the religion of the Achaemenid elite, emphasized duality, the eternal struggle between light and darkness, truth and falsehood. Its prophet, Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, taught that humanity had a moral duty to choose good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. At the heart of Zoroastrianism was the god Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, and his adversary Angramayinyu, the destructive spirit. While the religion never became a tool of forced conversion, its ethical outlook permeated Persian governance. The king ruled by the grace of Ahura Mazda, not just as a divine mandate, but as a moral responsibility. Zoroastrianism's influence would ripple far beyond Persia. Elements of its theology, heaven and hell, judgment after death, a messianic figure, would later appear in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But within the Achaemenid world, it served as a moral compass, subtly guiding law, administration, and imperial philosophy. Temples known as fire altars dotted the landscape, and rituals were performed in open spaces, where fire, the symbol of divine light, could burn uncontained. Darius I, who reigned from 522 to 486 BCE, built on Cyrus's foundations with ruthless efficiency. He standardized coinage, weights, and measures, introduced legal reforms, and expanded the empire into Thrace and the Indus Valley. At Persepolis, he constructed a ceremonial capital of staggering beauty, stone terraces, columned halls, and carved reliefs depicting tribute bearers from across the empire. The imagery was clear. Persia was not a land of one people, but of many, united under a king who ruled with both power and tolerance. Yet Persia's expansion would eventually bring it into conflict with the rising powers of the Greek world. The Greco-Persian Wars, sparked by Ionian revolts and fueled by cultural rivalry, pitted Darius and his son Xerxes against the city-states of Greece. Battles like Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis would become the stuff of legend, not just for military drama, but for what they symbolized: the clash between East and West, between empire and polis. In truth, the distinction was never that simple. Greek artisans worked in Persian courts. Persian kings admired Greek sculpture and philosophy. The borders were porous, and the exchange was constant. Despite military setbacks in Greece, Persia remained the dominant power in the region for over 2 centuries. Its model of imperial administration, religious tolerance, and cultural integrations set a precedent unmatched in the ancient world. When Alexander the Great eventually conquered Persia in the 300s BCE, he did not raise it, he adopted it. He married Persian women, wore Persian dress, and ruled from Persian cities. Even in conquest, the legacy of the Achaemenids endured. Persia was more than an empire. It was a bridge connecting civilizations, ideologies, and worlds. It proved that power did not have to rely on uniformity or erasure, but could instead thrive on diversity, respect, and infrastructure. In many ways, it was the first truly global empire, not because of its size, but because of its vision. A vision that, even in defeat, shaped the course of history. Long before borders carved up the modern Middle East, before empires ruled through fear alone, Persia offered a model of unity without uniformity. It stood as a testament to what civilization could be when guided not only by ambition, but by principle. And though its kings now sleep beneath broken columns, their legacy still walks among us, in the laws we write, the roads we build, and the ideals we claim to uphold. In the narrow strip of land between Mesopotamia and Egypt, where mountains met sea and desert met river, a unique convergence of peoples gave rise to some of the most influential cultures in human history. This region, known as the Levant, was small in geography but immense in consequence. It was a corridor of commerce, a battlefield of empires, a crucible of prophecy, and a bridge between civilizations. Here, traders became sea kings, tribes became nations, and spiritual revolutionaries changed the course of world religion. Among the earliest and most impactful of these peoples were the Phoenicians, maritime traders, and shipbuilders, whose city-states such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos flourished along the coast of modern-day Lebanon. Emerging around 1500 BCE, the Phoenicians mastered the Mediterranean long before the Greeks and Romans. Their ships traveled as far west as Spain and possibly even the Atlantic Ocean, establishing trade colonies and spreading their influence through commerce rather than conquest. They traded luxury goods, cedar wood, purple dye, glass, ivory, and metalwork, turning their modest homeland into a hub of wealth and diplomacy. But the Phoenicians' greatest gift to humanity was not material, it was linguistic. They developed a phonetic alphabet, a system of writing based on symbols representing sounds rather than whole words or syllables. This innovation made writing more accessible, efficient, and transferable. It formed the basis of the Greek alphabet, which in turn became the foundation of Latin, Cyrillic, and eventually modern Western scripts. In a very real sense, every sentence you read today carries the legacy of the Phoenician sea kings who once sailed the Mediterranean in search of trade and exchange. To the south, inland from the Phoenician cities, another story unfolded. One rooted not in commerce, but in covenant. The Hebrew people, or Israelites, emerged as a tribal confederation around 1200 BCE. Unlike their neighbors, their defining contribution was not architectural or naval, it was theological. Over centuries of migration, conquest, exile, and return, they developed a religious system centered on the worship of a single, invisible, transcendent God. This was a radical departure from the polytheistic norms of the region. Yahweh was not simply a local deity. He was the creator of all, the moral authority above kings and empires. The Hebrew scriptures, compiled over centuries, became the foundational texts of Judaism, and later, Christianity and Islam. In these texts, prophets emerge not as court flatterers, but as moral challenges to power. Figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos called out injustice, corruption, and idolatry, often at great personal risk. They spoke not only to their people but to the world, declaring that righteousness was greater than ritual and that nations would rise and fall based on how they treated the vulnerable. This prophetic tradition became one of the Levant's most powerful exports, a moral force that shaped civilizations far beyond its borders. Jerusalem, the city at the heart of this tradition, became more than a political capital. It was a spiritual axis, Its temple, first built by Solomon in the 10th century BCE, symbolized the covenant between God and his people. Even after its destruction by Babylon and again by Rome, Jerusalem's sacred status endured. It became the focal point of Jewish longing, Christian pilgrimage, and Islamic reverence. Today, 3 of the world's major religions trace their spiritual geography back to the single city, a testament to the Levant's enduring power as a source of sacred meaning. The Levant was also a battlefield, a place where empires collided. Egyptians, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all fought to control its strategic trade routes and fertile highlands. Yet despite these invasions, the region's peoples retained their unique identities. The Arameans gave rise to Aramaic, a language that would spread across the Near East and even become the spoken tongue of Jesus. The Philistines, often remembered only as enemies in biblical texts, were seafaring people with sophisticated urban centers. The Moabites, Edomites, and Canaanites each had their own cultures, deities, and histories, often interacting with and influencing their neighbors in complex ways. Throughout the centuries, what made the Levant distinct was not uniformity, but density of people, of languages, of gods, of ideas. It was a cultural crossroad where Egypt met Mesopotamia, where Indo-European met Semitic, where the sacred met the secular. Its value was never just in resources. It was in its position, geographically and intellectually, as a middle ground where traditions merged, clashed, and evolved. Even after conquest by the great empires of Persia, Greece, and Rome, the Levant maintained its role as a crucible of identity and resistance. The Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BCE, for example, was not just a Jewish rebellion against Greek rule. It was a defense of cultural autonomy in a world of imperial assimilation. And in the centuries that followed, Levantine thinkers, mystics, and scholars continued to shape the intellectual currents of the Mediterranean and beyond. In the grand narrative of the ancient Middle East, the Levant was never the largest, richest, or most powerful region, but it was the most resonant. Its impact was measured not in monuments, but in messages, in alphabets and scriptures, in songs and laws, in whispers from mountaintops and scrolls hidden in caves. It gave us the tools to speak, the words to pray, and the ethics to govern. The Levant was not just a place, it was a revelation. One that still reverberates in the languages we speak, the stories we tell, and the questions we ask about justice, faith, and identity. It reminds us that small regions can carry world-shaping ideas, and that between the mountains and the sea, history is never just written in stone. It's etched in the soul. In the highlands and plateaus of Anatolia, the landmass now known as modern Turkey, ancient civilizations carved their mark into stone, bronze, and iron. Neither fully Eastern nor entirely Western, Anatolia was always something in between, a land of thresholds where cultures met, clashed, and fused. It was the home of pioneering metallurgy, early kingship, mysterious languages, and enduring legacies that would ripple across the ancient world. While its history is often overshadowed by the more famous empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, Anatolia was a silent powerhouse, a crucible of innovation, resilience, and cultural fusion. One of the earliest and most formidable civilizations in this region was the Hittite Empire. Emerging in the late 17th century BCE, the Hittites built a sophisticated state centered at Hattusa, a capital fortified with colossal walls, monumental gates, and intricate administrative quarters. They spoke an Indo-European language, the oldest known example of that linguistic family, and developed their own cuneiform script, adapted from Mesopotamian models. But the Hittites were not mere imitators. They were architects of empire in their own right, establishing treaties, codifying laws, and waging wars with precision and strategy. The Hittites' most famous clash came with Egypt at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, a monumental standoff with Pharaoh Rameses II that ended in what is considered the world's first known peace treaty. This diplomatic document, etched in stone, reveals a shared political consciousness, a recognition that war could give way to negotiation, that power could be balanced, not just seized. It also marked Anatolia's central role in shaping early international law and diplomacy. The Hittite kings referred to themselves not only as warriors, but as great kings, equals on the world stage. Culturally, the Hittites absorbed and reinterpreted the beliefs of their neighbors. Their pantheon was immense, 1,000 gods of Hatti, drawn from Hattic, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian traditions. Religious syncretism was not just tolerated, it was embraced. Ritual texts, festivals, and temple complexes reflected this pluralism. In Hattusa, they built temples to storm gods, sun goddesses, and underworld deities, symbolizing their worldview, complex, layered, and eternally shifting. But the Hittite Empire, like all great powers, eventually declined. By around 1200 BCE, a wave of upheaval known as the Bronze Age collapse swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes disintegrated, cities were burned, kingdoms fell. The reasons remain debated: drought, famine, internal rebellion, invasion by the so-called Sea Peoples. But the result was unmistakable. Anatolia's great urban centers fractured into smaller regional powers. Yet even in this fragmentation, Anatolia remained dynamic. Out of this vacuum emerged new kingdoms that would define the Iron Age in Anatolia. Chief among them was Urartu, a kingdom centered around Lake Van in the eastern highlands. Flourishing from the 9th to the 6th centuries BCE, the Urartians were master builders, constructing fortresses, canals, and temples that displayed remarkable engineering skill. Their script, related to the earlier Assyrian cuneiform, recorded the deeds of kings and the rituals of a distinctive, often mountainous culture. The Urartians were also strategic, resisting Assyrian aggression through strongholds perched atop rocky cliffs, using geography as both shield and symbol. To the west, the Phrygians rose to prominence, remembered most famously for the legendary king Midas, whose touch supposedly turned everything to gold. Though the myth may be symbolic, Phrygia's capital at Gordion revealed a kingdom rich in artistry, architecture, and royal power. Excavations have uncovered monumental burial mounds, intricate wooden furniture, and vast feasting halls, indicators of a vibrant aristocracy. The Phrygians inherited Hittite cultural elements but reshaped them through their own aesthetic. Bold geometric designs, unique musical traditions, and a fierce independence that resisted both Eastern and Western conquest. The Lydians followed, ruling from their capital of Sardis and the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. Under King Croesus, whose name became synonymous with wealth, Lydia became one of the richest kingdoms of the ancient world. Their true innovation, however, was economic, the invention of coinage. The Lydians were the first to mint standardized government-backed coins made of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. This leap forward transformed commerce, taxation, and trade, creating new possibilities for economic organization across the Mediterranean. The simplicity of exchange through coined money would go on to fuel empires from Persia to Rome. Geographically, Anatolia's position made it a perpetual crossroads, bordered by the Black Sea, Aegean, and Mediterranean, and connected to the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus. It was a land of routes, for goods, for armies, for ideas. Mycenaean Greeks traded with Hittite kings. Persian envoys crossed Lydian roads. Assyrian armies marched through mountain passes. And later, Alexander's conquests and Rome's legions would follow the same trails. Anatolia absorbed all of it. Not passively but with agency, its peoples borrowed, reshaped, and contributed, creating a tapestry woven from dozens of threads. Anatolia's significance was not only geopolitical, it was deeply symbolic. Here, boundaries were tested. Cultures coexisted. Technologies evolved. Ironworking, adopted early and mastered by multiple Anatolian kingdoms, gave these peoples new tools of agriculture, war, and infrastructure. Religious thought, legal codes, artistic motifs, all passed through this corridor, transformed in transit. Even in decline, Anatolia's story continued. As Persia expanded westward, Anatolia's kingdoms were incorporated into the Achaemenid system. Satraps governed from Sardis, but Anatolian identity endured. Later, when Alexander swept through the region, he encountered not emptiness, but resistance in culture. Hellenistic influence would follow, and eventually Roman rule. But the foundations laid by the Hittites, Phrygians, Eurasians, and Lydians persisted, buried beneath stone, but alive in memory. In the ancient world, Anatolia was the heart of movement, not just of armies or trade, but of transformation. It was not the largest nor the most unified region, but it was the one where past met future, where empires paused and where cultures mixed. Its kingdoms were neither forgotten backwaters nor mere buffer states. They were innovators, architects, and custodians of change. Anatolia reminds us that history is not always written by the loudest conqueror, but often by the enduring bridge between them. In its valleys, highlands, and coasts, the pulse of ancient civilization beat steadily, not in dominance, but in dialogue. And through that dialogue, the world was forever changed. In the grand arc of history, there comes a moment when one world yields to another, when empires clash and a new order is born. Such a turning point unfolded in the ancient Middle East as Persian dominance collided with Greek ambition, and the old Mesopotamian heartlands were folded into a new global tapestry. This was more than war and conquest. It was the transformation of how power, culture, and identity would be constructed for centuries to come. When Cyrus the Great marched into Babylon, he did more than topple a dynasty. He absorbed an entire civilization into a more capacious vision of rule. But the Persian Empire was not invincible. As the Greeks emerged from their police rivalries, the energy turned outward. Persia's expansion into Anatolia and the Levant brought it to the doorstep of Greece. Tensions escalated through Ionian revolts and diplomatic fractures, and soon Darius I would marshal Persian power against the Greek city-states in the first great confrontation between East and West. The Battle of Marathon, where a smaller Greek force repelled Persian invaders, became mythic, a story of liberty resisting absorption. Later, Xerxes' invasion across the Hellespont and the stand at Thermopylae would be immortalized in legend. These battles weren't simply military victories or defeats. They were statements about world direction, whether empire or city would hold sway. At Salamis, the Athenian navy defeated the Persian fleet, marking a turning point not only in that war but in cultural memory. The Greeks would remain free for a time, and Persia's mythic aura would thereafter always be mingled with resistance. Still, Greece did not simply remain Greek. As Alexander the Great grew ambitious, he looked east. His campaign against Persia was not simply expansion, it was a fusion of worlds. When he marched into Babylon, Persepolis, and Susa, he doffed his armor and claimed continuity with Persian kings. He adopted Persian dress. He married Persian nobility. He encouraged cultural blending. Alexander's conquest did not erase Persian legacy. they reframed it. The Hellenistic world that followed was a hybrid world, Greek language, ideas, and politics layered over Persian geography, administration, culture. In this new order, the old Mesopotamian kingdoms ceased to rule in sovereign independence. They became provinces, cities, regional centers in a larger empire. This shift was seismic, not just in borders or armies, but in worldview. The idea of empire had changed. It carried culture as much as it carried soldiers. Greek philosophy, science, drama, and language spread into formerly Persian territory. Persian art, administrative systems, and cosmology filtered westward. New gods, new calendars, new literatures emerged at intersections. The old story of Mesopotamia, of ziggurats and law codes, did not vanish, but it became part of a broader tapestry. In these centuries, the Middle East became the world's pivot. Alexandria in Egypt became a nexus of Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Persian intellectual life. Babylon's astronomers contributed to Hellenistic science. Cities, once royal capitals, now served as crossroads of scholars and merchants. The Mediterranean world, long focused on the Aegean and the Italian peninsula, began to widen its horizon toward the east. Of course, resistance and continuity did not disappear. Local elites adapted. Temples remained sacred. Languages persisted. In Mesopotamian cities, local culture continued under new masters, survival and memory weaving alongside conquest. The old gods were honored, though sometimes in hidden forms. And local traditions, law, temple ritual, city councils survived the transition, often subordinated but not destroyed. This turning point marked the end of the ancient autonomous kingdoms of the Middle East, but it also inaugurated something new. A world where ideas, not just borders, were contested. The battle between Athens and Persia wasn't just about land. It was about civilization, about how culture would move, who would define knowledge, how different peoples would relate under a shared order. Before Alexander's death, the map had already shifted. Greek generals carved out kingdoms from his territories. The Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the Parthians. New dynasties blended Greek, Persian, and local traditions. The Middle East ceased to belong to one empire or one culture. It became a layered palimpsest, each era writing over the previous but never fully erasing it. In this crucible, civilization as we understand it was reshaped. What had begun in Sumer flowed through Babylon, stood under Persian skies. All now ran through the currents of Hellenism, syncretism, and cross-cultural fusion. The world changed, yes, but the ancient Middle East did not disappear. It transformed. It carried forward its memory, its stone, its wisdom, into a new age. From the mud of Sumer to the marble of Persepolis, from the scrolls of Jerusalem to the ships of Sidon, we've walked a timeline etched not just in stone, but in memory. The story of the ancient Middle East is not a single thread. It is a tapestry woven across thousands of years, through dozens of peoples, languages, and dreams. We began where humanity first etched time into clay, in the cradle of cities, writing, and cosmic law. We followed empires that rose like ziggurats and fell like the rivers they depended on. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Phoenicia, Israel, each added their chapter. Each shaped what would become the world. This was not a forgotten world. It was deliberately raised, its complexity reduced, its innovations claimed by those who came later. The narrative of civilization was rewritten through a Western lens, as if history began with Greece and Rome. But the truth was buried beneath that story. That law, diplomacy, monotheism, astronomy, empire, all were born between the rivers and and refined in the deserts and mountains beyond. They erased the timeline, not the truth. And now, the truth is resurfacing. And so we remember. We remember the traders who built alphabets, the prophets who challenged kings, the rulers who governed by code and conscience. We remember that empires can fall, but ideas endure if we choose to carry them. The ancient Middle East was not a relic, but a foundation. And in every language we speak, in every law we follow, in every number we calculate, its presence lingers. We are the generation that remembers, the ones who refuse silence, the ones who trace ancient roads back to their source, not for nostalgia, but for restoration. If this journey moved you, don't let it end here. Like this video to honor the first cities. Comment below and tell us what surprised you most, what connected with your story. And most of all, share this timeline. Share it so the world remembers where civilization truly began. Because history lives not in ruins, but in the stories we tell, and in the ones we choose to recover. This was the ancient Middle East before the world changed. And its story isn't over. It's just being retold.